Hi guys, welcome back to an episode on Ground Zero. Today I'm with Liam.
Hello.
He owns a record label.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean I should say strictly owned because at the moment we're on sort of like what they say in the industry, like indefinite hiatus.
Hmm.
So yeah, the label at the moment isn't active, but that may change very soon.
Hmm. So do you want to tell me a bit about yourself? Obviously, sort of your background, because obviously you were saying earlier it's a massive loop. Because you started all your stuff when you were at college, and
Yeah,
now I'm at the college, sort of.
yeah. So I mean I've lived in Poole all my life. Always loved music, and as I got to a certain age, started to make friends with people that were in bands,
Hmm.
and then realized that okay, I can't play an instrument, but maybe I could be the person that like puts on the shows or
Hmm.
like promotes the bands and does
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So yeah, so in 2004 I went to Bournemouth and Poole College, and yeah, I just wanted to learn a bit more about how the business of it all worked.
Hmm.
And at that point, media studies as like a subject was still quite a new thing.
Yeah.
And the secondary school that I was at didn't even do a media studies A level at that stage. So that was why I went to college. And it was
Hmm.
like, it seemed like quite a rebellious thing at the time to go to college and do this like full course on
Yeah.
media studies. So I started putting on gigs. And even when I was at college, I started what I thought was a record label,
Hmm.
which was basically me, and this will make me sound really old, doing CDR copies of my friends' bands. So like getting the tracks, like doing like running them on my parents' computer, like just burning
Hmm.
the CDs, and then like printing out the artwork and like cutting it and putting it in the sleeve. And then I've got a photo of me outside. There used to be a venue in Bournemouth called Mr. Smith's, which is like a classic, like
Hmm.
what they say, like toilet circuit venue. Like you could fit like 100 people in there, and it was very rough and ready. And ironically, I don't think the toilets even worked. So, but there's a photo of me outside the venue, like hustling, like handing out like the band's demos and stuff. So,
Hmm.
like even going back to that point, like it was something that I was like trying to take not like seriously, but as professionally as I could, even though it was
Hmm.
so DIY at that point. And then I went on to university, got a degree because I thought this music thing probably isn't going to work out. But the chances are so slim. So I got a degree, and I thought if it doesn't work out, I've got this to fall back on. At that point, I joined a band and started touring
Hmm.
with a band as well. And once that kind of came to an end, that felt like the right point to pick up on the label idea again.
Hmm.
So the second time around, did it actually did it professionally at that point, and that's kind of where it started. Yeah.
Hmm. So obviously you started at college and obviously the second time round, what are the key differences from the starting points? Obviously, one, it's quite, you're new to it, you're quite young,
Mm.
and obviously you probably didn't have the money to back it, so it's just like whatever you
Yeah,
can get. And obviously now you're starting it here, you've learned more lessons, you've probably got a bit more financial backing.
yeah.
What's like the key differences that you noticed from those two?
I think from playing in a band and we did like a few like UK tours and stuff.
Mm.
Like we got to see the industry outside of our local scene, if that makes sense. So I
Yeah.
think the first time around, it was just playing with what we had on our doorstep.
Hmm.
And then once you go out and you manage to play like in Newcastle or somewhere, you suddenly realize like, oh, okay, like it is actually possible to kind of like break the boundaries of like your local town. So I guess when we came to it a second time around, it was like we could work with bigger artists on this.
Hmm.
And I think the other thing is that the music industry had changed a lot in those sort of 5 or 6 years.
Mm.
When I started in 2004, things like Napster and MP3s were still sort of in their infancy.
Hmm.
And yeah, you could do like CDRs and burn that sort of thing. But actually, by the time you got to like 2010, 2011 range, which is when we started the label, um, physical media had kind of died. Like people weren't buying CDs anymore because streaming was a thing. So you
Mm.
didn't need to even pay for MP3s. But weirdly, what was then happening is that vinyl had this like resurgence. So though people didn't want CDs, there was like a small group of people who did still want to have their music on like an actual thing that they could hold in their hands. And the vinyl is obviously nicer than the CD because it's bigger to begin with.
Mhm.
So rather than having like a little pocket-sized artwork of it all, you've got this nice big thing that you can hold in your hands and be proud of. So I think the music industry kind of changed in that it created this sort of like sub fan of like real sort of like die-hard like
Mhm.
collectors and like like nerdy, like audiophile type music fans. And that is where we sort of found our entry point was in through that. So the idea when I secondly started the label was to kind of pick up where I'd left off and just to work with artists. But then this final thing happened, and that was what we pivoted to, and started working with bigger labels like Warner Brothers and Sony to license some of their artists' music to press to vinyl. Because at this point, even though vinyl was starting to take off, the major labels weren't interested in it, because for them it was down in the noise. See, they were more interested in the likes of Taylor Swift and Ed Sheeran and stuff who were starting to take off and playing great big huge music venues, and they were signing them to deals which were, they used to call like a 360 deal. So the record label realized they couldn't make much money off these artists other than streaming. So they would sign them up for deals that would include all of their merchandise and touring, all that sort of thing. Vinyl was just like a small like consideration to them. So when we would message and say like, can we get the license to do say 500 or 1,000 copies? The major label was like, sure, it's going to cost you this much to acquire the license. Fill your boots, like go ahead and do it, because they weren't interested. That changed over the time that we were running the label, because eventually the major labels picked up and was like, actually, no, vinyl has become really popular again. Yeah. And then they got back on board. So for new releases, it became increasingly hard for us to actually get the rights to do that stuff, which kind of spelt the end for what we were doing.
So that goes into my next question, because obviously with the music industry, it's ever changing, whether it's from trends or how stuff come in and out, or licenses with these, like Sony, like you said, getting the vinyls. How do you sort of deal with all the changes consistently, and how do you like keep up with them?
That's a really good question. I think you're kind of rolling with the punches of it all. And I mean, you look at artists that have had like really long careers over 5, 6, maybe even more decades now. You think back to like the 50s when pop music became a thing. Like these artists reinvent. They have to stay like on the pulse. And I think sometimes you see these like cringeworthy moments from artists where they're like delving into what they think the new thing is, and it might not be. Like it might be that they, like, do you remember mini discs? Like mini discs were a thing. So like tiny little plastic things that you fit into like a Sony Walkman type thing, but you could fit. It was like the precursors to MP3 players, but it was a thing for a while, and then it like died a death because it got superseded by the MP3 player. Now that's happened again a little bit, I think, with what's happening with NFTs right now, or in the last couple of years, where everyone kind of jumped on that, and it doesn't seem to have really gone anywhere. So you get these like misfires from artists, and I mean, I guess we didn't really experiment that much with those things, because we sort of found our niche with the records. So we were kind of like playing in like a very limited time period of like a trend. And when we saw the trend was starting to reach a saturation point, that was when we decided we're not going to try and reinvent. We're going to cash out now, essentially. And yeah, so it's a really good question. I think you just have to just be quite versatile in the music industry.
And are these quick changes, or are these like, okay, we'll block it out for the next 2 months to slowly implement them over time?
I think it can be either. Like some things can happen overnight, like in terms of trends, and then other times you can sort of see it coming a mile away. Like, so for us with the records, like we could see that something was happening there. I don't think we ever predicted that it would get to the point where it is now, where you go into, so where we're recording today, we've got a HMV branch downstairs. Like it's all vinyl in there, like, and then like some Blu-rays, and then like some actual record players that you can buy, and then a lot of merchandise. Like there's hardly any CDs or anything like that in there anymore, but the amount of vinyl that they've got is insane. Like when I started collecting vinyl myself in probably 2003 sort of range, you could go into this same branch of HMV and there'd be like 10 records in there, and like a few 12 inches, a few 7 inches, and that was it. And if you didn't get there first, someone else in the town who was like the fan got there. They get it, and you wouldn't be able to get it again, because at this point you weren't really able to buy stuff online. But now we've got HMV that's got all these racks of records. There's Boiler Room Records, which is an independent that are based just around the corner here on Kingland, and they've got 2 branches in Poole that's selling pure vinyl, like stacked to the rafters in the place. It's crazy. So I think that's a trend that has taken time to get to where it is now. But as I say, then you'll get other things like, you know, TikTok almost seemed like it happened overnight. You know, that the whole concept of like adding like these song clips to your TikTok video, and then that breaks an artist, like that just came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, like all these artists that just jumped on that earlier, they're selling out like the O2 Arena and stuff. So it's like bits of both, really, I'd say.
I mean, even now on TikTok, you can just post a video now, and like the first few videos, you can just get 1,000 views straight off the bat.
Yeah.
So growth-wise, TikTok seems to be the way to go now. But with starting a record label, how do you avoid, from your experiences, the stagnant sort of period where you may have, let's say, got a band, you got a few gigs, but then after that, you might fall into the there's nothing there, but it's quite stagnant.
Yeah.
How do you branch out from that?
So the majority of what we were doing was licensing stuff from bands that already had an audience. Yeah.
Mhm.
So we didn't have the challenge of having to break a new artist.
Mhm.
So we were working with bands that already had a fan base. So when we were putting records on sale, they were, you know, sometimes selling out at pre-order,
Mhm.
which was great for us because sometimes we hadn't paid all the invoices to actually get the things made. So, you know, we could actually, through the pre-orders, we could go through that process. With the money that we made from doing those successful releases, we then tried to reinvest in new artists.
Mhm.
And that's where it became really, really difficult. When a band hasn't got an audience, it's totally different, yeah, because you've got to try and find or build that audience for them. And I don't mind admitting that we didn't succeed at that. Like that was, you know, an outright failure in some cases. And I can say like there was a couple of acts that we worked with that by the time we had the stock, I think the band had pretty much broken up. Like when you're working with new artists, it's so fragile, the whole thing, where you're dealing with like you know, a group of guys that are in their sort of like early 20s or whatever, that are going through life, that, you know, they can be making great music one day and then at each other's throats the next.
Yeah.
And the other thing as well is like the hype disappearing as well. But by the time of us like seeing the band rising up through, wanting to work with them, getting the deal laid out, then recording, us getting the masters, pressing the records. By the time you get the records, like sometimes the audience have moved on a little bit as well.
Yeah.
I can think of a release where I think we'd only pressed like 250 records. And then when it actually went on sale, I think we sold about 7, you know, and I had all this stock. I was like, what do I do with this? So we, just to tell you like how we did manage to bounce back from that, is we would bundle those with the bigger artists. So we'd find ways to think, okay, well, we can make the money back on the bigger release if we like put these records in with the stuff that we were shipping out. So when people were receiving, they go, oh, I get a bonus 7-inch. And, you know, had we had the resource to do that over a longer period of time, maybe some of the fans that we'd sent the other stuff to may have got into that band, and then by the second release, we might have then managed to sell some. So, I mean, doing all this stuff DIY, you know, we didn't have huge investment amounts behind us to be able to have like the marketing budgets to really break these artists. So we were really relying on them in terms of like their touring and getting out and playing. And we just sort of covered the vinyl part of it.
So I've got 2 questions which sort of interlink. I'm guessing you dealt with gigs before, obviously getting the bands and gigs, I'm assuming. So the first one is obviously how do you branch from obviously doing the local gigs to maybe the more outside, like you said, you go to Newcastle or you might go to like Teddy Rocks, which is more the local one.
Yeah.
And then the next one which is linked is with the bands, do you go for more of like a corporate business relationship or more personal, get to know you sort of relationship? And how do you balance the two between getting to the gigs and being all friendly with them to know we need to do, let's say, this many sales, you need to do
these are fantastic questions, by the way. So I think having played in a band myself, when I think back to the conversations that I'd have with bands, I would always lean heavily into the I've been in your position, you know, because you just have to, because it's how you kind of build that rapport. And I think when you look at the big labels, like, you know, if they're talking to record execs that have never played in a band or had any experience of that, it's very hard for them to kind of connect on that level. The reality is, although I'd done the band thing and I could connect that way, I perhaps sometimes didn't have the the corporate bit to kind of back it up.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean? So I was
Yeah.
having to kind of like ride on just the personal experience and hope that was enough. And I think particularly for the new artists that we work with, it was it was a good icebreaker to kind of get to know them, and even some of them like I played shows with and stuff, so I kind of knew some of the bands, and they knew ours. Um, with the bigger artists, I would always lean more into like being a fan, if that made sense.
Mhm.
Do you know, just to sort of like convey the passion that you had for their band,
Yeah.
and that had to sort of account for the lack of not professionalism, because I think we always carried it in a professional way, but the lack of experience maybe, or like seniority, that sort of thing. And you know, it's funny. So one of the bands that we worked with, uh, it's a side project from my all-time favorite band when I was growing up, Less Than Jake, and it was a side project that the bassist had started, and I messaged and said, "Look, could we release your music in the UK?" And at first he was interested, and then it went quiet, and then he said, "Well, we've actually found someone else we're working with." And I was like, "That's fine. I kind of expected that." And then nothing happened. Didn't hear anything about this band. So then I went back and contacted him. I said, "Is the music coming out?" And he said, "Well," he said, "the guy kind of lost interest." He said, "You actually seemed a lot more like keen. I kind of want to work with you." I was like, "Good." Like, you know, like my strategy kind of like paid off there.
Yeah.
You know, like I could have, you know, given it all the kind of corporate line, but that with a lot of these artists, that's just not the language that they spoke. You know, I think I was very fortunate that I was running this with my friend Tom, who I got to know through the band that I was in. He managed a few of our tours that we did. He is a lot more comfortable in the sort of business side, whereas I lean more into the creative side. So as a partnership, we worked really well. So if ever it came down to things like contracts and stuff, I would just be like, Tom can deal with this, you know, and not totally wash my hands of it, but just recognize that it might be good for the bands to see that there was like a good dynamic there between us as a pair. And I think that worked pretty well.
So obviously you just mentioned that there's the business side and you're the more creative side. So sort of how that dynamic sort of link together? Like what sort of your roles and what obviously he was probably more the get the tours set up, get the seats sold, get the contract signed. I'm assuming you're more like get the graphics done, get all the vinyls printed, and
pretty much, yeah. I mean, when I look back now, I think I was, you know, in some respects, just like acting as like a hype man for the whole thing, you know. But that, not to say that I wasn't doing anything. I mean, I would run all the social media, which was starting to come up through at that point, becoming more of like a viable channel for promoting what we were doing. And yeah, Christ, what else did I do? I did a lot of packing orders to ship. And yeah, I mean, I guess sort of steering some of the creative sort of side of what we were going to do for the releases. So, you know, what kind of vinyl we wanted to go for, that kind of thing. And that's not to discredit Tom, because he would be involved in that in some respects as well. And then just like a bit of artist liaison and that side of things. Whereas like Tom would deal a lot more with the like the orders for actually putting the orders into the pressing plant and dealing with that. And man, like because vinyl had gone into such like obscurity, there was pretty much one plant that was dealing with all of the orders for the whole industry. So you would put things in, and as I say to you just a minute ago, like waiting for things to come back. Sometimes you would wait for like 6 months to a year to get your stock in. So you'd have to do this stuff with quite a long lead time. And Tom was very good at sort of scheduling that thing and dealing with the plant and making sure that we would get our test pressings that we'd get to actually listen to and make sure that it was all right. Because you don't want to press like 500 or 1,000 records with a mistake on. So we'd get like sort of 5 or 10, you know, pre-copies to listen to. So yeah, Tom was good with that, but obviously better with money than I am in managing that side of it. So yeah, I think as a partnership, it worked really well. And given that we were doing this as a part-time thing on top of both having full-time jobs, I don't think we could have done it without one another to sort of bounce off the ideas and to kind of share the load on things.
So looking back at your career, obviously you started back in 2003, which is scary because that's when I was actually born.
Yeah, I mean, in 2003, I was still at secondary school.
Yeah, that's like your first sort of like dipping your toes into the industry. Up until now, what was your like, lowest and highest moment that you've experienced?
I mean, I don't know if I can point to a highest one in general. I mean, the most insane thing is that I got to work with Less Than Jake, because that was like the first band that I was really a huge fan of when I got into music. But not only that, the drummer from the band, he had started a record label, and used to write a lot about like how the industry works and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And I've still got a lot of like printed out like interviews with him and stuff, like in a ring binder at home, that I wish I'd got him to like sign or just like take into him and say like, do you remember saying these things? And I learned so much, not just about bands, but about the industry from that band. And they kind of gave like a blueprint for like how to do things like the right way, how to have respect for artists and how to have respect for like the music scene and that sort of thing. And yeah, getting to work with them. And there was a time, maybe this is the highlight, is 2015. We'd already done a couple of projects with the bass players, other bands.
Yep.
And then sitting on their tour bus outside the O2 Academy in Bristol. And basically, so Vinny the drummer was like telling us what we should do with our business. And we're just sat there, just lapping it all up, just like taking on all this, like all these lessons and things. And it was like, back to like when I was younger, like printing off the interviews and things, but instead of printing it off, on my parents' dodgy old Windows computer, like I was sat there like just being schooled on what to do on the tour bus. And that's just like, it just blows my mind even now, like thinking that we got to do that. It's one of those things that I kind of managed to sort of articulate this at the weekend. It's a world that I never thought we'd get to step into. And the funny thing now is that I can't step back into the world that I came from, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I can't go back to being that fan who dreamed of working with these artists, because I've seen the other side of the glass, So yeah, I can never be 15 again. I can never go to my first Less Than Jake show. But I went to my 40th Less Than Jake show at the weekend, and I got to see some of the band and and catch up and that sort of thing. And that's now become like the normal bit,
Yeah.
So in some ways, like I'm trying to get back to the start. So I'm doing a lot of like listening to new artists now, and it's kind of what's inspiring wanting to get back into this, because I'm like, I found like 5 or 6 bands that I really like that I'd love to be able to work with. So I'm sort of trying to start the cycle again.
So obviously, if someone's looking to start, because obviously the point of this is from where you started.
Yeah.
If someone wanted to maybe step into the music industry and start a record label, for example, what would be like your sort of, okay, this is like a rough blueprint of how to start, the rough starting point, and how to develop onwards from that?
I think we're at a point now where everyone is quite capable of running their own social media channels and things. Yeah, it's just second nature to the generation that's coming up through now. Because of that, a lot of bands can do their own thing. Whereas like years ago, they would rely on someone that had this skill set to be able to do it for them.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of bands take this stuff in-house now. So the question becomes, what's the role of a small label in this day? I wonder whether it's like we were talking about before, where we say about the trends and being ahead of the curve. I wonder whether for someone who's looking at doing something like this, is to have their finger on the pulse on what's changing, and to be able to go to bands and say, look, there's this emerging model, whether it's we refer to TikTok, but the next TikTok, right?
Yeah.
To look for that stuff, to be an innovator, and to then go to the artist and say, look, I love your music. I think what you're doing is great. I could take your band and expose it to a wider audience through this thing that is about to pop in the next couple of weeks.
Like, for example, something that's been getting quite big is like virtual concerts.
Yeah.
So it's like just getting that ahead of the curve, sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think if someone was looking at this around the time that the pandemic happened, and it invested in a little bit into it and learned how it works, and some of the platforms like I'm trying to think of some off my head now, but I'm drawing a blank because I can't think. But like there's platforms that you go to that you pay an amount to actually watch a live show. Yeah. So if you got on board with that, or let's say that you'd set up like a a very basic but great looking like film studio in like a like a room that we're in today, like with just some affordable cameras, and you could film the band playing to actually to do the virtual concert that way. When the pandemic then happened, you'd have been in a prime position to go to every artist and say, look, me and my crew can come out, film it, distribute it, do all that thing. And there were people that did this. Like some of the names, as I say, I can't think of them at the top of my head. They were already looking at this technology. They were just waiting for a moment to use it.
Yeah.
It's like the QR code. Like the QR code existed for about 10 years. It only really came into use in the pandemic because suddenly we couldn't touch things, so we had to scan stuff. People have got to think about that in terms of like the music industry and audiences and how habits and tastes and stuff are changing. So I think the record label of the future isn't maybe even a record label. Do you know what I mean?
It's more of like an innovator.
Yeah, it's like a music label. When I was coming up through, clothing labels became a big thing. I don't know how prominent that is today. I mean, my fashion sense is awful. I'm wearing band t-shirts from bands that I was into 20 years ago. But everyone I knew was starting a clothing label, and they would just, find a company that could print t-shirts cheaply, and, bringing on board artists and making loads of money just selling runs of t-shirts, and that became huge. But to bring it back to music, you need to think, what's the next format for music? So one of the things that we experimented in, and this is before we got into vinyl, because obviously vinyl was an expensive thing to dive into until you start making the money back. One of the things I looked at was like, okay, so people don't want CDs, but they do want something physical. So I started to combine music with art prints. So we would get because art prints were cheaper than vinyl, we would get like a nice run of like A3 art prints of like the artwork to go with a song. And we were even sending the songs to artists and saying, look, no rules at all, just draw something based on what you're hearing, be inspired by it. And then getting things back. And sometimes the artists would be like, as in the bands would be like, that doesn't look at all like we wanted it to. Other times they're like, wow, like this is someone's interpretation of it. So that was a cool little thing to play with. It didn't really take off, but stuff like that, that's the thing that I'm still always like kind of thinking a little bit about. But sometimes I feel like I'm kind of an age now where I'm a little bit behind on it. So you want people that are in their sort of like late teens, early 20s that have got the time to experiment with new technology and stuff. And new platforms, and just try and find like a little bit of a business model that can just earn them a bit of money to kind of reinvest back in, and then maybe one day they hit the jackpot. Because this is the thing, like with artists, like if you just happen upon an artist that just has a certain rapport with their audience and it just clicks, then you could go from like what I was saying, where we sold like 7 copies to selling 7 million. It can happen. The example, I was speaking to somebody earlier on today about how, so are you familiar with the band Wet Leg?
No.
Okay. So they are playing like every festival in the UK. They play Glastonbury, Reading Festival. They're on like US talk shows. They've got big banners in Times Square in New York. Like, they've done really well. So they are maybe 2 or 3 people that went to music college on the Isle of Wight, right? And they went to this college with 2 people that were in a band that we worked with, right? So the story I always tell is like, we were working with the band next door. Like, so there was Wet Leg and there was the band that we knew. And actually there's a few years between them starting Wet Leg. But it just goes to show that had we continued working with the band that we were, and then got to know those guys, like we could have been the ones that were involved when Wet Leg suddenly broke, Obviously, I can't take any credit whatsoever, but I'll certainly, joke about it. But it's just incredible to me. Incredible that, like, they would have been at the shows of the band that we were working with, and then like within 10 years now, there's huge act. You just never know. But I think so. Sorry, your question was about advice. So I think it pays to have, a good sort of concept. But then it pays to have a good personality as well. Like you can have a concept, but if you're not
approachable,
or like interesting and creative yourself, what is your label? Do you know what I mean? What does the label stand for? Like one of the best examples I can think of in recent times is the band in 1975. Their label, Dirty Hit, they've got a bunch of bands. Now, because people like one of the bands on the label, they like 4 or 5 other bands too. And it's kind of like created this like personality around the label rather than just be a name. People would go and see a tour that was like the Dirty Hit Records tour. So you've got to find like something to go with on that. And I don't know whether we ever really, I mean, our label was called Saint November Records, right? So it was originally going to be called Saint Catherine Records because you know, like a like a Catherine wheel, like spins round like a firework thing. It's like, well, a record does this too. I was like, so that's what we should call a record label. But there was a punk band called the Saint Catherines. So I was like, okay, what can I kind of go to? So I pivoted to Saint November because I was like, it kind of works, right? And we had like some cool artwork drawn up and stuff, but I feel like we could have done more to sort of build that brand of the label as well. I think we were more interesting than some, but not as interesting as others. So I think that's the advice: is find the concept and the platform, and work on your personality and the brand part.
So, is there any advice or any last points that you want to sort of get out to the audience that you're wanting to get out, or if I've missed any questions that you just want to?
I think do it when you're young. Like get started. I mean, obviously you can pick up this thing at any point in your life, but I think when you're younger and you've got less life commitments, mortgages, long-term relationships, children, pets, you can afford to just drop everything and go and join a band on a tour, or jump in the car or on the train and get to London, or in some cases move to London. So I think that's probably one of the biggest bits of advice, is that if you want to do this, get started, even if what you do initially is like a prototype, or like a precursor to what you end up doing 10 years down the line. Going back to the beginning of our chat, like when I was doing the CDRs and burning it off and that sort of thing, I didn't have a first clue how I was going to like put an order into a manufacturing plant that was going to press all these records for us. I still can't even believe that they did it. It would have been great to actually go to the plant and see it happen. All I know is that one day I get a knock at the door and there's like a huge, great big pallet with boxes and boxes of records, all like cellophaned up. It's like they just like arrived like from Father Christmas or something. So yeah, just but going back to that beginning point where you just do whatever you can with the resources you've got at that point, and then just build. And along the way you'll learn, you'll make mistakes, you'll learn from them. And as long as you can kind of keep getting back up, I mean, I talked about the highest point. I haven't talked about the lowest point. I got sort of dodged that question. I can think of loads of lows. Like, when records turned up and we'd got something wrong, like with the artwork. It's really hard when you're putting things to print, let alone the records themselves being correct, but the artwork, the sleeve, like you've got to get everything right on a screen and then hope that when it's printed that it's correct. And I think it was our first big one that we did that it came back and there was some pixelated like part of the artwork. It still cuts me up now, like even like thinking about it, because that's on all those records and that's our first record. So as much as I'm proud of that first one, I'm almost like a little bit still like ashamed of it. But we could have called it a day there. We could have gone, we can't do this. We failed. We hadn't failed. Like we just failed at one bit. So the next time we got that bit right. Yeah. So I think as long as you can kind of work on that mindset, the bits that you get wrong, you can correct the next time. But that's got to rely on you ensuring there's a next time. Yeah. That's how you keep going.
So it's actually having that resilience to go.
Resilience is the word. Yeah.
Okay, I failed here, but that's not going to stop me. I've got to jump over and keep going, keep going.
And I think if you're really passionate about it, you will keep going. Like this is the thing. Like it was all I wanted to do. And people ask me now, like, what would you really like to do if you could do it? And I'm like, I did what I wanted to do. It just didn't pay the bills. I couldn't make it, particularly with two of us, we couldn't earn enough money through doing it to pay each of our salaries when we're buying houses and things. I still got to do it, and I got to work with the bands I like, tour, press records. So I've done my life ambition. I need to find a new one now. And in the meantime, I'm very lucky to work with a company that I enjoy working with, and that does fortunately pay the bills. But now I'm kind of settled back in that. I'm now, as I say, starting to look at how can I step back into this in a way that is manageable, that allows me to still do a little bit of it and almost take a bit of a victory lap, with the lessons that we've learned, and not necessarily the pressure to have to make it pay. But I'm figuring that bit out. So maybe when we talk again, I'll maybe update you on that.
So yeah, no, that'd be interesting. 'Cause it could be like a full transition video of how you went from starting it all to then working, then coming back into it.
What I need is a load of young people who've got good ideas, and I'll work with them.
No. Well, if there's nothing you want to add, I haven't got any more questions.
No, this has been a really enjoyable chat.
Yeah,
Great.
no. Well, it's nice chatting to you, Liam.
Thank you, mate.
Thanks for coming on.
All the best.
Thanks for listening to the episode, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Obviously, this has been episode 3. Hope you enjoyed. I'll catch you in the next one. See you all later. Bye-bye.